man stands midway across a recently built footbridge spanning the perhaps 200-yard width of the Youghiogheny River in the tiny town of Ohiopyle in southwestern Pennsylvania. Early morning, October here, apple weather. The man would see his breath now, even if he weren't smoking a cigarette. He leans on the high wood railing and taps the ashes off into space. He watches the cinders whirl like snowflakes, buffeted by air currents he can't see. Watches the gray particles merge with the gray-black river. The man looks at the water and thinks, 8, or maybe 9. The man has been here before, to Ohiopyle, some 25 years before when he was 11 or 12, on a canoe trip with his father and another boy and his. His father had driven them miles winding along the river, the Yacht it was called, like the sound of one clearing his throat. They had then carried the canoes down a steep, rocky path and put in to float and paddle hours back to the town, where they dug for shore and then waded with the canoes and pulled them out just there by the bend below the railway bridge. The bridge that the man knew now had stood firm for 100+ years, built to move lumber since the river was too shallow in places to float the logs downstream. Now the town's sole function was outdoor recreation. That and its proximity to two residences designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is the purpose of the man's revisit, now with a university architecture school where his second wife studies, she and a dozen others here on a field trip. They'll visit the famous Falling Water, built upon one of the Youghioghany's tributaries, and they'll travel a few more miles to Kentuck Knob, the other of Wright's houses in the area. The man's second wife, Elise, has a daughter from her previous marriage who is not along on the trip. Lizzie, a precocious girl of 11, asks many questions these days, honest and thoughtful questions. She's smart enough now to know that there's much she doesn't know, especially about the grown-up world. It's a situation that will reverse in just a few years when she'll think she's got it all down, and the grown-ups are so lost, the man and Elise both know. But I bring up the girl, Lizzie, because her questions are the kind the man asks these days, too. Why would the president lie? How can a dealership sell cars below cost? And the answers aren't straightforward. The logical connections aren't obvious at all. The man sees the point on the river where he believes they pulled out their canoes years ago. A few hundred yards downstream, just behind him now, a stretch of churning white water begins, perhaps a half mile long, with several severe drops, where kayakers hold competitions, even Olympic trials. In the turbulent pools beneath such a falls, a kayak that overturns can spin loose its pilot and float to the surface to be retrieved, while the occupant is pulled down into the rocky whirlpool and is held under, spinning like a barrel or a mill wheel driven by the falling water, held under and completely inaccessible until the water chooses to release the battered body. This was the story of one kayaker just weeks before the two fathers and two sons had arrived in Ohiopyle. The spot in the river a ranger pointed out as off limits, as if they'd been tempted to have their go at it. In that incident, 3 days passed before the falls had released the body. That had been just below the bridge that crosses into town. What town there is, a general store and railway stop, and outdoor outfitters and several competing raft-guided tour offices, canoe and kayak rentals and equipment, a youth hostel and a hotel and several bed and breakfasts, all that's necessary for a small town supported by an outdoor sports economy. And if it wasn't for that purpose, the place would be desolate and gray as the other crossroads they passed coming in, places with maybe a post office and a couple shops, winter-defeated farmhouses and leaning barns, places they drove through feeling hopeless and asking each other, if we lived here, what would we do? What do any of these people do? The man can't quite remember the other boy's name. He thinks it begins with H, Henry maybe, a yellow letter anyway. He remembered him as a nice kid, sympathetic without words to the relationship the man had had with his father. The man also remembered a time about that age when he and some school friends had been trying to remember a kid who'd moved away some years before, thought his name began with F, and the man had said it was a green letter anyway. And the other boys had looked at him crazy, and he hadn't voiced such an idea again. Until then, he thought everybody else saw the world that way. He'd felt different, alone. From the bridge, the man feels the long-ago canoe trip wash through his mind, more visceral than a visual memory. Remembers the moment when the man, who was just then 11, peeling an apple, dropped his father's jackknife into the cold, so clear water that was wavy with current. The steel flashed blue brilliant as it sank not 3 feet under, and the canoes not moving the speed of a brisk walk. Yet there was no getting back there to that exact place on the river again. And already, not 2 seconds later, the knife was gone, and the boys and their fathers continued gazing over their twin canoes' narrow gunwales. The boys seeing then thousands of gems catching the sunlight, pebbles and shells and sand and rocks, flashing that could be the knife blade. And all four realized at different moments, but very quickly still, that there was no going back.